I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly.
Come here, child. Let me have a look at you. The Countess beckoned with a long, thin, ruby-jeweled finger, slowly advancing toward the trembling servant girl. Stopping, she smiled with an evil countenance that dripped of venomous, dark, almost sexual longing. Lucrezia Borgia. Before we start today's episode, if you're watching on YouTube, you're probably noticing a big change. I have moved to focusing on strengthening a couple of things with Margs and Mayhem, and that is making for a switch to a purely podcast-based format. Most of you all listen on your favorite podcast app anyway, so I think it'll be an easy switch for most of you. If you're a YouTube exclusive viewer, you can definitely still listen via YouTube, or you can switch over to a podcast, totally up to you. I intend to upload the podcasts also to YouTube every week. I always appreciate feedback. Remember that we're on Instagram, Facebook, and as of last week, TikTok. My DMs are always open on those platforms. Also, comments on YouTube are fine and welcomed as well. Also, we have an email. margsandmayhem@gmail.com is the address. Please reach out. I love Marg recommendations, case recommendations, feedback about past episodes, and ideas to make things better for all of you. Today's margarita needed to be dark, dark red. Blood red, if you will. It is, naturally, the story of the Blood Countess, after all. So we're going with a dark cherry margarita. For this margarita, we cannot use the bright red fake maraschino cherries, but we must use something more bitter and dark. Amarena are wild dark cherries that come directly from Italy and are considered to be a gourmet treat or ingredient. Not only will this give us a drink that isn't overly sweet, but it will also give us that color that we desire. So for today's margarita, we're going to mix 2 parts tequila, 1 part triple sec, 1 part lime juice, and just a touch of the cherry juice from the Amareno jar. You'll put all of those ingredients into your shaker, shake it up, and strain bougie over fresh ice into a salt-rimmed glass. Throw a couple of those Amarena cherries in for good measure and a bitter end to the drink, just like our villainess of the day. Today's story takes us back in time several centuries and also takes us halfway across the globe. It'll be up to you to separate fact from fiction, but of course, I'll give my opinion. The Blood Countess might have been the world's most prolific female serial killer, of all time, or she may have been framed, targeted for her wealth, influence, and gender. Just so y'all know what you're getting yourselves into. The legend of the Bathory family begins in the year 900. A God-fearing warrior named Vitus sets out to fight a dragon lurking in the swamps near a castle. He kills the dragon that has been tormenting the villagers with 3 thrusts of his lance, and the grateful peasants bestow the name Bathory on him. This means brave hero. A few years and maybe more accurate history later, Erzsébet Bathory, or Countess Elizabeth Bathory. We're going to go with Elizabeth because it's best you don't know how long it took me to get the Hungarian pronunciations right. Anyway, Elizabeth was born in Nyírbátor, I think I got that, Hungary, on August 7th, 1560. Her parents, Anna and George, were first cousins. Much speculation has gone into how the consanguinity within her family may have led to both her physical health conditions and some mental illness. If you didn't know, how dare you? Consanguinity is the scientific term for inbreeding. It's defined as a marriage between individuals who are second cousins or closer. Elizabeth, it's documented, suffered from epilepsy. It's possible also she suffered from migraines, and those are noted as a common affliction of children of consanguineous parents. It's pretty common knowledge at this point that these children are also more likely to suffer from cognitive and genetic disorders, but more recent studies are showing that children born of first cousin consanguineous parents are at greater risk for common mood disorders and psychoses. More on this later. And don't marry your cousin and then have children. Just don't. Don't know much about Elizabeth's childhood, but a couple of things are important to note here. First, Elizabeth was born into a noble family. That's at least half of the reason that her parents married each other anyway. Got to keep the wealth in the family, you know? Secondly, Elizabeth was born in the late Middle Ages in Europe. There were no legal regulations in regards to how to treat human beings, particularly ones of the peasant class, and frankly, just about any type of torture was allowed and practiced, not even just in war. Torture was a commonplace form of punishment throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. It was a violent time. Elizabeth undoubtedly grew up seeing torture all of the time, and at least according to one story, relished in seeing servants tortured. Though there's not much written record about Elizabeth's childhood, it's believed that when she was somewhere between 6 and 11 years old, a Romany man was sentenced to death in her family's court. As the man wailed at night, Elizabeth heard the cries and was intrigued. Next day, she snuck away from her governess to go see the execution. The method? Well, start drinking. Either a dying horse or a perfectly fine horse, depends on who you ask, I guess, was held down and had its stomach cut open. The living man was stuffed inside, except for his head, and then the belly of the horse was sewn back up. Then, the horrific sight was left to rot in the sun, cooking both horse and human. Evidently, this was not the idea of the Bathory family. The Romans were the brilliant ones with this torture method. Regardless, legend has it that small Elizabeth found this, well, hilarious. Nice. Legend also has it that one of her uncles instructed her in Satanism, while her aunt taught her all about sadomasochism. Take those tidbits with however many grains of salt please you. Oh, also, interestingly, not only was Elizabeth educated in all things torture and pleasure, but she was known to be one of the most conventionally educated women of her time as well. She read and write, which was unusual for literally anyone during that time. Estimates put the literacy rate in that century at less than 20% overall. It was undoubtedly higher for the noble class, but educating women was, let's just say, not a priority. But not only could Elizabeth read and write in Hungarian, she was also fluent in other languages, such as German, Latin, and Greek. She was a smart lady. Arranged marriages were the norm at the time, and at around age 11, Elizabeth's marital fate was sealed. Ferenc Nadasdy was her betrothed, a 15-year-old nobleman. He, or let's be honest, his parents, invited her to move into the family castle, Castle Sádvad, in western Hungary. Apparently, this was also fairly common practice. Unlike Elizabeth, Ferenc could barely read or write, even in Hungarian. Apparently, he had a basic understanding of speaking Latin and German, which he would use later in war. More on that later. There is a story, again, salts, take them as you will, that as a 13-year-old, Elizabeth became pregnant with a peasant boy's child. When the child was born, it was given to a local family, and the peasant boy may or may not have been castrated and torn apart by wild dogs. Sources are spotty at best on that one, so you know. In any case, that indiscretion didn't stop the plans, and Ferenc and Elizabeth were married on May 8th, 1575, at Verano. Ferenc was 19 and Elizabeth was 15. 4,500 people attended the wedding, which was a lavish 3-day affair. Logistically, how is that even possible? So many chairs, 4,500 chairs, food, who knows? Though both families were of the uppermost Hungarian class, Bathory was actually a more honorable name than Nadasdy, so they agreed that Ferenc would adopt the maiden name of his wife. How downright modern of them. In what could be considered the nicest wedding gift ever, Ferenc gave Elizabeth a castle. Yes, an entire castle. And if you don't think that's extravagant enough, the gift of the Kastis castle also included ownership of the 17 surrounding villages. Just 3 years into their marriage, in 1578, Count Ferenc took over one of the flanks of the Hungarian army. He was frequently away from home, which left Elizabeth to manage the household, and as mentioned before, the household was an entire castle and the nearby villages, so it was a pretty big job. Elizabeth was also left to the devices that earned her a Marks and Mayhem episode. Elizabeth and Ferenc did have 5 confirmed children. Anna was born in 1585. Their second daughter, Orsoya, was born in 1590. Cataline was born in 1594. Andras in 1596, and Paul in 1598. Catiline and Andras would die in childhood. They may have had 2 other children, Miklos and George, but those aren't 100% confirmed. Again, I need to put the following in some historical context. It's important to know that Europe in general, and Hungary in specific, were embroiled in wars for the majority of the 16th to 17th centuries. Cruelty was a generally accepted part of life. I'm not making excuses, I'm just contextualizing. Wartime massacres, bloody mercenary campaigns, and torturing of civilian peasants were just a part of everyday lived experience of the time period. It's possible that in addition to her early exposure to torture, Ferenc and Elizabeth were actually 2 peas in a pod when it came to torture of the local population. In fact, he may have schooled her in techniques when he wasn't off fighting the Ottoman Turks. It's said that when they were teenagers, he showed her how to roll up pieces of paper, dip them in oil, put them between the toes of whatever servant girl was around, and light them on fire. He may have given her a glove with claws so that she could scratch the faces of insubordinate servants. Fun. They sound like a lot of fun. Ferenc himself was known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his extreme cruelty to Ottoman prisoners. Regardless if she was torturing alone or with her husband, she was certainly doing a lot of it. Elizabeth was 43 when Ferenc died in January of 1604, and the tortures and murders didn't stop until 1610. In fact, it is said that after her husband's death, the tortures became more sadistic and violent. But actually, she wasn't doing it alone. She had 4 servants who also relished in the torture of the local peasant girls who were frequently sent to the castle for good, honest work, never to return again. These young women and their families were powerless in the face of a family such as the Bathories, and they didn't dare speak up when their daughters disappeared. What was happening in the castle? Okay, so what we have coming up next probably needs, at least 1, maybe 5 of those black cherry margaritas. So go ahead and pause here, go to the description box, whip them up. Okay, here we go. Some of the servant girls were whipped with stinging nettles or had needles driven into their fingers if they, for example, made a mistake while they were sewing. In the wintertime, some servants were stripped naked and sent into the snow to have water thrown over them until they froze to death. Elizabeth was known to bite shoulders and breasts of some of her victims and cut their noses and lips. Some of the girls were covered in honey and left outside for the insects to devour. Elizabeth would pour boiling water on her victims and seemed to enjoy peeling off their cooked skin. Oh, I'm sorry. There was a torture chamber inside her castle where Elizabeth and her goons would use all types of tools to inflict the most pain on the young girls, leaving them begging for death. One of Elizabeth's favorite pastimes was using scissors to slice open the skin between her victims' fingers. It's even suggested that they would force some of the girls to engage in self-cannibalism. As early as 1602, rumors began to circulate around the villages that peasant girls looking for servant work at Elizabeth's castle were disappearing. But with their power and influence, nothing was done. Elizabeth was untouchable. Over the course of 16 years, estimates of her murders range from 36 to over 600. Yeah, I said that correctly, 600. It's a pretty wide range, and more on that later. The bodies, I hate to go here, but the bodies. There were so many bodies. Where did they put all of the bodies? In order to avoid arousing suspicion, she may have had some of the bodies buried in fields, dumped in streams, and put in secret locations. Some legends say there were bodies buried within the castle walls themselves. The story goes that so many of the girls of the lower social class went to the castle and didn't return that those villages actually ran out of young women. Soon enough, Elizabeth was forced to go outside of the peasant class and started murdering daughters of the gentry. Some were sent to Elizabeth, who, remember, was well educated and obviously intelligent, for their education at a kind of finishing school. Oh, no pun intended. And that's where things went wrong for Elizabeth. You see, any mistreatment of servants was of no concern to authorities, but the alleged crimes against women and girls of noble birth, that could not stand. The court palatine of Hungary, who also happened to be her cousin, George Thurzo, was ordered by King Matthias II, then King of Hungary, to investigate Elizabeth. It's purported that upon his arrival to the castle, Count Thurzo surprised Elizabeth in the middle of her torture of a victim. On December 30th, 1609, Elizabeth was immediately imprisoned in her home. Her noblewoman status ensured there was no way she'd be put in prison like a common criminal, and her 4 servants were arrested. The servants were questioned and tortured. They spent quite some time throwing each other and their former employer straight under the horses' hooves. 289 witness statements were gathered. The servants were put on trial in 1611, and 3 were executed. 1 was sentenced to life imprisonment. Although never questioned or tried, Elizabeth was confined to her chambers at Castle Countess, given a life sentence. Count Thurzo indicated that she was to be kept in a bricked-up room, but according to the few that visited her in her last years of living, she was essentially under house arrest, simply not being permitted to leave the castle. On the evening of August 20th, 1634, the Countess called for her guard and told him her hands were cold. He replied, "It's nothing, mistress. Just go lie down." The body of 54-year-old Elizabeth Bathory was found on August 21st, 1614, in Castle Countess. According to her will, all of her fortune would be given to her children. She was buried in the church cemetery in a local village, but it caused such an uproar that her body was moved to her family crypt in her birth home. The location of her body today is unknown. Ferenc and Elizabeth's children were banished from Hungary and went to Poland. So the question is, was Elizabeth Bathory a bloodthirsty villain, seeing no act too cruel to inflict upon poor, innocent young girls? Or, as a wealthy, powerful, intelligent woman, was she targeted by a fellow nobleman in order to profit from invented crimes? So we have to look at how we know all this information about Elizabeth. A lot of it is legend, and much of it I didn't even bring up in the timeline of her life. You know the phrase, bathing in the blood of virgins? You know the idea that if you rub the blood of virgins on your skin, it makes it young and you're youthful forever? Well, that legend or saying or belief comes from Elizabeth Bathory. This idea that she would kill all of these young girls and bathe in their blood in order to either stay young or to treat her epilepsy. But this is complete fiction. And these bloodbaths started being mentioned a full century after her death. She may have influenced Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, despite what Halloween fanatics will tell you, is a work of fiction. And a lot of what we know about Elizabeth comes from her trial. However, the way the investigation was done was sus. Elizabeth's goons, the servants that allegedly helped her, they were arrested, questioned, and tortured themselves. Yes, they were tortured to get information about Elizabeth's torturing. It's probably common knowledge by now, but torture is not an effective method of interrogation. In fact, according to neuroscience professor Shane O'Mara, abusive interrogation techniques can, quote, compromise memory, mood, and cognitive function, end quote. So we can't really trust anything that they said under this amount of duress. In situations like this, people lie constantly to get the torture to stop. It makes perfect sense. Even then, the accounts of these servants only state that there were between 36 and 51 murders. Okay, just to be clear, 36 is a lot, but it's not 650. The 650 number is complete hearsay and was never verified in any way. What about those witness statements? Count Thurzo gathered 289 of them, but more than 250 of those witness statements offered complete hearsay or literally no information. Many of the witnesses who spoke against Elizabeth had obligations or were indebted to Count Thurzo. Okay, so some of this stuff is clearly sus, but what would the motive have been to take Elizabeth down? Her family, including her money-hungry sons-in-law, would have been able to take control of her vast wealth. The Habsburg Court and King Matthias II owed Elizabeth money. In fact, the king called for the death penalty at first, and this would have meant that the king could seize her land. Elizabeth also had made powerful political alignments that the Habsburg did not agree with. And at the end of the day, Elizabeth was a wealthy, powerful, well-educated, intelligent woman in 17th century Europe. Elizabeth Bathory was, by all accounts, intimidating as hell, and she'd probably had a target on her back since the day her husband had died, or maybe even before that. So what do you think? Is Elizabeth Bathory the most vicious female serial killer in recorded history? Has she earned her nicknames the Blood Countess or the Master of Cheda? Where does fact end and fiction begin? How does her incestuous birth factor into her potential psychopathy? Is there a psychopathy we even need to investigate, or was she just a powerful woman? Is it possible that it's kind of a combination of both? That she was cruel to the degree that cruelty was an accepted part of life in this time period, but perhaps not as cruel as the trial and testimonies would have you believe? I love this case. I think that it's the perfect example of how practices of the time, as well as time itself, can warp truth into something much more interesting, and how it leaves us to parse through and separate what's true and what's not. Over 600 murders in 16 years is more than likely impossible. That's a murder a week. And though with the level of cruelty expressed, it might be possible, but I just don't think even in the 17th century, that many murders could go unnoticed. I guess I should say that many bodies. If you want my opinion, Elizabeth was a cruel woman. She undoubtedly had physical and mental illnesses stemming from her lineage. She also grew up in a home, or castle, I guess, where torture was the norm, and she literally watched it happening from childhood onward. When she was betrothed, her fiancé showed her new torture techniques like it was a medieval video game. It was the culture of the era. And it goes without saying that her torture of these young women probably led to some deaths. I would guess more like 40 deaths, which is an astounding number, but a more logical one. I do think Elizabeth was targeted for who she was and what she had. I think they were scared of her power and her influence, and they tried to take it all away from her. I guess in many ways they succeeded, and maybe even worse, they distorted her life and irreparably corrupted her legacy for all of time. Thanks for hanging out with me, and thanks again to my YouTube followers for understanding. I'm excited that the episodes are going to be more well and deeply researched because I can use the time that I was using to edit video-based episodes to do more in-depth research on the cases themselves, which is why I really think you're all here. I know I said it once, but it bears repeating. Follow us on social media and jump in on the conversation. Tell me what's going right and what could be better. And thank you to everyone who has rated Margs and Mayhem on your podcast apps. I can't tell you how much that helps. It really pushes the podcast up in the algorithm. Help me cheat the system. Come on, y'all. Next week, we explore the life and crimes of George Joseph Smith, a serial killer who really didn't want to be married even though he tried it several times. We're also going to make our first Winerita. I'll see you next week. And remember, there are always alternatives to murder.